Hello and welcome to episode 32 of the 1001 Movies podcast. The podcast based on the book 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die. This episode we'll be talking about André Delvaux's 1965 Belgian film, The Man Who Had His Hair Cut Short. Yes, after nearly 2 months without a podcast episode, I'm back. Before we talk about the film, a little bit of housekeeping. Due to the time and work involved in researching, recording, and editing every podcast episode, I'm obviously unable to commit to a weekly or bi-weekly release schedule. However, I've decided to take inspiration from other podcasts and release episodes in a series of 12. So after this episode, I'll begin working on the second official season of this podcast. This means that there might be some time between this episode and episode 33, but there will be 12 weekly episodes in quick succession, followed by a break before season 3 of the podcast. This means, of course, that I probably have no hope of covering every movie in the book, but really, aren't we just all in this for the fun of it? Now, on to the film. The Man Who Had His Hair Cut Short was the first feature film in André Delvaux's career. He taught language and film at the Athénée Fernand Bloom in Brussels between 1949 and 1962, during which time he made a number of documentaries about film and music for television. In 1963, he co-founded the INSAS Institute in Brussels, where he continued to teach cinema, and then he had the opportunity to direct a feature film with funding from Belgian television and the work of the students under him. Delvaux began writing The Man Who Had His Hair Cut Short, based on the book of the same name by Johan Daisne. It's interesting that Delvaux chose to film Daine's book, as at a cursory glance it seems almost unreadable. Daine's story was about the insane ramblings of a man obsessed, and he refused to write it in a way that followed traditional rules of prose. The novel barely follows any kind of paragraph structure, let alone sentence structure. Delvaux, however, found inspiration from magical realism, an art form in which reality and fantasy were often indistinguishable, and he undoubtedly found the novel a pleasing challenge to film. The movie is about Govert Mervelde, a middle-aged teacher at a small girls' school who becomes obsessed with Fran, one of his students. The story opens on graduation day, and we see Mervelde awkwardly and unsuccessfully trying to offer Fran a parting gift and express his true feelings for her. We flash forward several months later and learn that, perhaps because of guilt associated with his marriage and family, Mervelde has quit teaching at the school and taken a job at the Justice Department. He's invited by a colleague to attend an autopsy in a small town several hours away, and Mervelde reluctantly accepts. After awkwardly watching the autopsy in a small church graveyard, he encounters Fran at the local hotel. She's now a famous actress. Overwhelmed again by his obsession with her, Mervelde decides to encounter her and tell her his true feelings. He does so, and although she initially welcomes his advances, things quickly take a turn for the worse. What happens next I will not reveal, but by the end of the film it's unclear whether Mervelde is a changed man or if he remains in his own world of delusional fantasy. The film received a lukewarm reception when it first appeared in Belgium, with some critics calling Delvaux the man who would not cut his film because of his long shots hovering about people in rooms during long conversations. This was par for the course in European cinema at the time, but it seems Belgian audiences had developed a taste for the silly comedies and love stories that were prevalent in the 1960s. It was not until the film was released internationally that it garnered real praise, and after Godard and other prominent New Wave filmmakers wrote glittering reviews of it in cinema periodicals, The Man Who Had His Hair Cut Short became the most critically acclaimed piece of cinema ever to come out of Belgium, and perhaps still is. What did I think of it? Like many European films of this era, the merits of the film really don't lie in the plot, but in the art. Delvaux chose to make more of a narrative structure out of Daisne's novel than Daisne did, and in the first half of the film we're presented with Mireveld as an awkward but otherwise well-adjusted human being. True, he's a married man with an unhealthy obsession for a young girl, but he's nowhere near the madman that Daisne wrote about. Yet. During the autopsy scene, the film shifts from a simple narrative to magical realism, and Delvaux goes from open-wide shots to close-ups of the autopsy stools and the hands of the surgeons while Mireveld looks on, growing more and more uncomfortable. The scene mirrors one from the beginning of the film, in which Mireveld receives a haircut and a scalp massage, thus the title, but juxtaposed, these two scenes are polar opposites. They're filmed the same way, but one clearly gives Mireveld pleasure, while the other makes him uncomfortable. After the autopsy scene, it seems as though something within Mireveld has fallen apart, and we cannot believe he's actually going to bare his heart to Fran. When she returns his affections, it's all too clear that what we're seeing may not in fact be reality, but some sort of fantastical scene daydreamed by Mireveld. Direction aside, the film is also a fascinating little character study about Govert Mireveld and the unhealthy nature of obsession. His love of Fran is clearly irrational, and in the film's opening scene we see him thinking about her while straightening up objects in his office. Mireveld is bald but for the sides of his head, yet he insists on getting a relaxing haircut at the risk of being late for his school's graduation ceremonies. This is a man who is clearly a learned teacher, lawyer, and professional, yet he is overwhelmed with not only his desire for Fran, but the insistence of finding pleasure in tactile and visual objects. Later, when we learn that he has quit his teaching job, Mireveld voices his envy for people who can go through life without suffering the need for such pleasures and obsessions. Of course, his world crumbles around him, beginning with the autopsy scene and culminating in what is either a prison or an insane asylum. It's never really clear which. I would not recommend The Man Who Had His Hair Cut Short to just anyone, as it is by no means the Hitchcockian psychological thriller that some write-ups seem to say it is. It took me 3 viewings, yes, 3 viewings, to fully grasp what I was watching. And it is indeed as slow as molasses in January, despite the 95-minute running time. Nevertheless, like many films of the era and region, it's a movie that I enjoyed for the filmmaking aspect itself, and I would recommend it to anyone interested in European neorealism or magical realism of the era. That's all I have to say about The Man Who Had His Hair Cut Short. Join us next time for the first episode of Season 2 of the 1001 Movies podcast, in which we discuss the 1999 horror film The Blair Witch Project, directed by Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez. In the meantime, feel free to leave happy reviews for the podcast on iTunes, like it on Facebook, and email me at 1001moviespodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, happy viewing.